Somewhere beneath every ocean, every sea, every freshwater inland passage that runs deep and cold and far from shore, there are ships that never came home. They went out with crews and cargo, with maps and ambitions, and then they simply stopped. Some left wreckage. Some left nothing at all. A few left behind stories so strange, so persistent, so stubbornly resistant to explanation, that we're still turning them over centuries later, still holding them up to the light to see what we might have missed. UNESCO estimates there are over 3 million undiscovered shipwrecks lying on the floors of the world's oceans. 3 million. Even the most comprehensive catalogues of documented wrecks account for only a fraction of that number. The rest are down there in the dark, unnamed or half-remembered, waiting for the right technology, the right expedition, or simply the right question to bring them back into view. What that number tells us, beyond the sheer scale of maritime loss, is that the sea is the largest archive in the world. It keeps everything. It just does not always let you read it. This video is a journey through some of the most famous entries in that archive. We're going to move through time, from the earliest European ventures into uncharted waters, through the age of sail and steam, all the way to the modern era of sonar arrays and remotely operated vehicles combing the deep for answers. Along the way, we will encounter ships that vanished without a convincing explanation. Ships that were found abandoned with meals still on the table and no sign of struggle. Ships that were seen wandering the seas for decades after they should have sunk. And ships so laden with gold and silver that the legal battles over what they contain have outlasted the governments that sent them out. Some of these stories are grounded in meticulous documentation, court records, manifest logs, eyewitness testimony, newspaper reports. Others exist in a space where documented fact bleeds into myth, where a real voyage becomes a legend, and a legend eventually finds its way into opera, into literature, into a kind of cultural memory that outlasts whatever truth originally sparked it. Part of what makes these stories so enduring is precisely that blend. The sense that something genuinely happened, that real people were on board, and that nobody has ever fully accounted for what became of them. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. We begin in the 17th century, on the Great Lakes of North America. Those lakes, which hold roughly 21% of all the surface fresh water on Earth, were described by early European explorers as inland seas, and with good reason. They are vast, unpredictable, capable of generating storms that can swallow a vessel as thoroughly as any ocean. It was on those waters that a small two-masted bark called Le Griffon set out in September of 1679, loaded with furs and pointed toward the east, and was never seen again. It was the first European vessel of its size to sail those lakes, and it disappeared on its very first return journey. That story sets the tone for much of what follows. Human ambition moving faster than human knowledge of the environment, and the environment responding accordingly. From there we travel through some of the great unresolved puzzles of maritime history. The Flying Dutchman, that phantom ship condemned to sail forever without reaching port. A legend so vivid and so widely reported by sailors across centuries that it demands examination even if it resists easy explanation. The Mary Rose, a Tudor warship that sank in 1545 within sight of the English shore and lay on the seabed for more than 400 years before being raised in one of the most significant archaeological operations ever attempted. The Mary Celeste, discovered drifting in the Atlantic in 1872, with its crew vanished and its cargo untouched, a case that has generated more theories than answers and remains, officially unsolved. We will look at the SS Waratah, a passenger liner that disappeared off the South African coast in 1909 and was never found, and at the SS Beichimo, an Arctic cargo vessel that was abandoned in pack ice in 1931 and then continued to drift, crewless, across Alaskan waters for decades. We will spend time with the Titanic, not just the sinking itself, but what came after, the investigations, the legislation, the long years before the wreck was finally located nearly 4 kilometers beneath the North Atlantic. And we will look at the Andrea Doria and the Spanish galleon San José and the question of who owns the treasures that lie on the ocean floor, a question that turns out to be far more complicated than it might seem. Running through all of these stories is a common thread. Each of them starts with a disappearance or a disaster, something that happened and was imperfectly understood at the time. Each of them then passes through a long period of speculation, of myth-making, of competing theories. And many of them eventually encounter modern science, sonar and submersibles and photogrammetric mapping, tools that let us see the seabed with a clarity that earlier generations could not have imagined. Sometimes that technology resolves the mystery, sometimes it simply adds new layers to it. The sea has been keeping these stories for a very long time. Tonight, we start reading them. In the late 17th century, the Great Lakes were not a destination. They were an obstacle, a boundary, the edge of the known world for European cartographers who had heard of them mostly through the accounts of Jesuit missionaries and indigenous traders. The French crown had a different view. Those vast interior waters were a highway, a route to the fur wealth of the north, and, if ambition held long enough, to whatever lay further west. Into that vision stepped René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, one of the most driven and difficult men in the history of North American exploration, a person constitutionally incapable of accepting that something could not be done. La Salle wanted to build an empire in the interior of the continent, anchored on the fur trade and extended southward toward the Mississippi and, he believed, ultimately toward a waterway to the Pacific. To do that, he needed a ship. Not a canoe, not a bateau, but a real vessel, capable of carrying significant cargo across the unpredictable waters of the Great Lakes. He had it built near Cayuga Island on the Niagara River, and the construction itself was a feat of improvisation under pressure. Timber had to be felled and shaped through a harsh winter. Materials had to travel enormous distances along fragile supply routes. The local Iroquois and Seneca watched the project with suspicion, and La Salle's men spent as much effort managing that political tension as they did hammering planks. Gifts were given. Truces were negotiated. At least one plot against the shipyard was reportedly foiled. The finished vessel was named Le Griffon, after the heraldic creature that appeared on the coat of arms of La Salle's patron, the Count of Frontenac. She was somewhere between 45 and 60 tons, armed with 7 cannons, and when she was launched in early August of 1679, she was the largest sailing vessel these waters had ever seen. To the indigenous peoples gathered on the shore, she was something with no category in their experience. Accounts from the time describe canoes of Huron and Ottawa men paddling out to circle the ship at St. Ignace, staring up at what they called the Great Wood Canoe, something vast and incomprehensible, moving through waters they had crossed in birch bark for generations. Le Griffon set out on her maiden voyage on the 7th of August 1679 with a crew of somewhere between 32 and 34 men. She crossed Lake Erie, pushed through the currents of the St. Clair and Detroit rivers, and made her way up through Lake Huron and onward to Green Bay at the western edge of Lake Michigan. There the crew loaded the hold with approximately 12,000 pounds of beaver pelts, an enormously valuable cargo worth somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 French francs. Along with rigging and anchors intended for a second vessel, La Salle planned to build further south. It was September 18th when Le Griffon turned eastward and headed back toward Niagara. She never arrived. Contemporary accounts describe a violent storm rolling in over Lake Huron, the kind of gale those waters can generate with almost no warning, waves steep and close set, nothing like the long swells of the open ocean, and far more dangerous to a vessel of Le Griffon's size and design. The crew reportedly hauled down the top masts and tried to ride it out. Then the ship disappeared from the historical record entirely. No wreckage was confirmed. No survivors reached shore. La Salle, waiting at the eastern end of the lake, eventually accepted that the ship, his cargo and his men were gone. The financial loss was catastrophic. The human cost was quietly absorbed into the enormous ledger of people the continent had already swallowed. What exactly happened has never been established. The storm is the most obvious candidate, perhaps driving Le Griffon onto one of the hidden sandbars that European charts, such as they were, had no knowledge of. Some accounts suggest the pilot had been warned about worsening weather and chose to sail anyway. Others have raised the possibility of sabotage, given the number of parties with reasons to see La Salle's venture fail. None of these explanations has ever been confirmed by physical evidence, because no wreck has ever been positively identified as Le Griffon. She sits somewhere out there, beneath lake water that in places runs very deep and very cold, and she has been called the Holy Grail of Great Lakes wreck hunters for good reason. Modern sonar surveys have produced promising anomalies. ROV footage has raised hopes more than once. Each time, the identification has failed to hold. The first European ship of her size to sail these waters remains the earliest recorded ship loss on the Great Lakes, and very nearly 350 years later, her final resting place is still unknown. The Griffon is a mystery grounded in the physical world. A ship built from real timber, loaded with real cargo, sailed by men whose names sometimes appear in the historical record. Her disappearance belongs to the category of things that happened, even if we cannot say precisely how or where. But maritime history has always moved between two different kinds of darkness. One is the darkness of incomplete evidence. The other is something older and stranger, built not from the absence of facts, but from the presence of fear. To understand the sea as sailors once understood it, you have to step for a moment into that second darkness, into the world where ships are doomed by oaths and captains sail forever without port or pardon. That world has a name. It has had one since at least the late 18th century, when a book of travels by a man named John MacDonald, published in 1790, recorded what his sailors whispered about a Dutch ship encountered in a storm off the Cape of Good Hope, a vessel that had vanished and was now seen only in foul weather, a bad omen, a warning delivered too late to matter. The ship was already a legend by the time MacDonald wrote it down. The first printed reference suggests oral roots going back considerably further, most likely into the 17th century, when the Dutch East India Company was at the height of its power and its ships were making the long haul around the southern tip of Africa with brutal regularity, riding out storms that no chart had prepared them for and that no amount of seamanship could guarantee surviving. The Cape of Good Hope was not named ironically, but it might as well have been. Sailors who had spent weeks crossing the South Atlantic arrived at its latitude to find weather systems of extraordinary violence, depressions that stacked waves 50 feet high and drove horizontal rain across visibility down to a few ship lengths. The route was unavoidable if you wanted to reach the spice markets of Asia, and the Dutch wanted to reach them more than almost anyone. Hundreds of voyages, hundreds of opportunities for something to go catastrophically wrong. And in that accumulation of storms and near misses and actual sinkings, the legend found its raw material. The core story, as it crystallized over decades of retelling, involves a captain. His name varies depending on which version you encounter, Van der Decken in the most enduring tradition, though Falkenberg and Bernard Fokker appear in other regional variants, and this inconsistency is itself revealing. There was likely never a single historical figure behind the myth. What the legend needed was not a specific person, but a specific kind of arrogance. The captain, whoever he was in any given telling, swore an oath in the middle of a killing storm that he would round the Cape no matter what it cost, no matter how long it took, even if he had to sail until Judgment Day. In some versions, the oath is addressed to the devil. In some, it is simply hurled into the wind. Either way, the answer comes back. Very well. You asked for it. The ship is condemned to sail forever. The crew does not die because they cannot die. They are locked into a perpetual present, always in the storm, always at the Cape, always trying to round a headland they will never clear. And as they drift through the world's oceans in their endless circuit, they appear to other ships as a warning. To see the Flying Dutchman is to know that something terrible is coming, that the sea has marked you. The early literary versions amplified this with careful detail. A story published in Blackwood's magazine in May of 1821 gave the captain the name Van der Decken and introduced the motif of cursed letters. Letters the dead crew tries to pass to living sailors, letters that carry their curse with them if you accept them. Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, published in 1798, is not the Flying Dutchman story directly, but it draws from the same deep reservoir of maritime superstition, the idea that a ship can become an instrument of punishment, that the sea has a memory for transgression and a patience for revenge. Sir Walter Scott worked with similar imagery in Rokeby in 1812. These poems and stories were not inventing the fear. They were giving it a shape that landlocked readers could finally hold. Why did phantom ship stories take such a powerful hold in the age of sail? Part of the answer is practical. Sailors in the 18th and 19th centuries genuinely saw things at sea that they could not explain. What we now understand as fata morgana, a superior mirage caused by thermal layers in the atmosphere, can make a distant ship appear to hover above the water, or to float inverted in the sky, or to loom enormous against the horizon before vanishing entirely. In the right atmospheric conditions, a vessel that is actually below the visible horizon can appear fully formed, sailing in impossible silence, apparently crewed by no one. Modern optics explains this. Sailors working the long Southern Ocean passages with no science education and considerable reasons to believe the world was full of warnings did not have that explanation available to them. What they saw looked exactly like what the legend said they would see, but the legend was also doing something more than explaining optical anomalies. It was giving form to things that had no other form. The open ocean in that era was a place of profound isolation, weeks or months from any authority, from any news of home, from any certainty that home still existed. Weather could kill you without warning or apology. Disease moved through a crew faster than anyone could treat it. The captain's word was absolute, and if the captain was wrong or corrupt or simply unlucky, there was no appeal. In that world, the idea of a ship cursed for its captain's pride was not just a story, it was a theology. It said that hubris had consequences, that the sea was a moral environment, that it was watching. For sailors who had no other framework for understanding why good men died and bad storms came without reason, that theology offered something, not comfort exactly, but meaning. The legend's cultural life did not end when steam replaced sail. Wagner's opera De Fliegende Hollander, premiered in 1843, transformed the doomed captain into a romantic figure. Centuries of solitude wearing away everything except his yearning for redemption, which can come only through the faithful love of a woman who chooses him freely. Wagner was not interested in maritime history. He was interested in what the myth said about longing and damnation, about men who carry curses they only half understand. The opera brought the legend into concert halls and made it serious literature. Then came the sightings. In 1881, a young officer in the Royal Navy made an entry in his ship's log describing a luminous vessel sighted off the Australian coast during a night watch. The officer was Prince George of Wales, later King George V. 13 officers and crew saw it. The log entry is matter-of-fact, almost clinical, which makes it stranger rather than less. Whatever the prince and his crew saw that night, they were certain enough to write it down, and certain enough that it mattered. The 20th century gave the legend a different kind of afterlife. Opera and literature gave way to film and television, and eventually to a franchise in which the Flying Dutchman became a supernatural warship captained by an octopus-faced villain in a blockbuster aimed at children and their parents. Something of the original terror drained away in that translation, but something also persisted. The core image, the ship that cannot stop, the crew that cannot rest, the endless passage toward a destination that will never arrive, retained its grip on the imagination long after the practical conditions that gave birth to the myth had disappeared. What the legend understood, at its deepest level, was something the sea teaches everyone who spends enough time on it. The ocean has no interest in your intentions. It does not care how skilled you are, how devout, how deserving of survival. The Flying Dutchman is the dark mirror of every voyage that succeeded, the reminder that the difference between arriving and sailing forever was sometimes nothing more than where the storm chose to go. The Flying Dutchman belongs to the sea of the imagination, to the place where fear takes shape and sails on without anchor. But some of the most haunting stories the sea holds are not myths at all. They are afternoons, specific, documented, witnessed by crowds standing on the shore and over in the time it takes to draw a breath and lose it again. The 19th of July, 1545, the Solent, the narrow strait between the southern coast of England and the Isle of Wight. A summer day, warm enough, with the French fleet visible offshore and the English fleet moving out to meet it. Among the English ships was the Mary Rose, pride of Henry VIII's navy, a vessel that had been part of the king's ambitions for more than 30 years. She'd been built at Portsmouth between 1509 and 1511, commissioned by a king who understood that naval power was political power made visible. Henry was 20 years old when her keel was laid. By the time she sank, he was 53, fat and imperious, watching from the shore. The Mary Rose in her prime was a carrack of somewhere between 500 and 700 tons, measuring perhaps 45 metres from stem to stern, armed with between 60 and 80 guns, bronze and iron, mounted on multiple decks, capable of delivering broadsides that represented the very cutting edge of what naval warfare had become. She had fought in earlier campaigns, been refitted and enlarged in 1536, and sent out again carrying more guns, more ambition, and more weight than the ship's original design had been built to accommodate. She carried somewhere between 400 and 500 men that day. Soldiers, sailors, gunners, officers, surgeons, carpenters, cooks. The engagement with the French fleet began in the morning. The Mary Rose fired a broadside. Then, as she turned to bring the other guns to bear, the accounts vary slightly on the precise sequence. Something went wrong. A sudden gust of wind, strong enough to matter in that moment of transition, caught the ship as she heeled through the turn. Water poured through the lower gun ports, which were still open from the broadside. The heel deepened. Water found more gun ports, and within minutes, perhaps less, the Mary Rose went down in approximately 12 metres of water within full sight of the English coast, with Henry VIII watching from the shore. A Flemish survivor left testimony. The imperial ambassador wrote a report. Both described the same terrible swiftness. The ship did not struggle for hours. She tipped and she went. Of the hundreds of men aboard, only a handful survived. The anti-boarding netting that had been rigged above the decks to prevent enemy soldiers from climbing over the sides may have trapped men below as the ship rolled. The weight of armour and equipment would have made swimming nearly impossible. Most of the crew drowned within sight of England, within sight of the king. Why did it happen? This is where the evidence becomes complicated, and where the honest answer is that no single explanation has been fully proven. The open gun ports and the gust of wind represent the most widely cited theory, supported by the physical evidence of the wreck itself and by the eyewitness accounts. But historians and maritime archaeologists have proposed several other contributing factors, and it is likely that more than one was in play. The 1536 refit had added significant weight to a ship not originally designed to carry it. Heavier artillery on higher decks shifts a vessel's centre of gravity upward, making her more vulnerable to exactly the kind of sudden heel that sank her. The ship's new commander may have misjudged the turn, or ordered it at the wrong moment. There is also fragmentary evidence, debated but not dismissed, that a French cannonball may have struck the hull. The most truthful thing that can be said about the sinking of the Mary Rose is that it was probably the result of several dangerous conditions arriving simultaneously. A ship that had been made more powerful than she was safe, on a day when the wind made no allowances. This was not an isolated failure. It was a symptom of an era. Naval warfare in the early 16th century was changing faster than the knowledge needed to manage that change. Guns were getting heavier. Ships were being modified to carry them, sometimes on multiple decks, sometimes in ways that compromised the stability the vessel had been designed with. The Mary Rose was in many ways the most advanced warship of her age. She was also, by 1545, a ship whose power and whose vulnerability had grown together, one feeding the other in ways that no one fully understood yet. The loss of the Mary Rose was not just a tragedy. It was a lesson in the hidden cost of rapid innovation, written in the most permanent of inks, that the sea preserves as well as destroys. When the Mary Rose settled into the Solent's silty floor, the anaerobic mud began to work on her hull, burying the starboard side in conditions that allowed almost no decay. And inside that buried hull, a world was sealed intact. Not a world of great moments or political decisions, but the world of ordinary men spending an ordinary morning at sea. More than 19,000 objects would eventually be recovered from the wreck, but even as numbers they fail to convey what they actually represent. A pewter jug that still held traces of its contents, a a shaving mirror, polished bronze, small enough to fit in a pocket, combs, some wooden, some horn, shaped by the same human vanity that has always accompanied the waking hour, personal seals, rosary beads, leather shoes still shaped to the feet that once wore them. The surgeon's cabin yielded medical equipment, urethral syringes, ointment jars, a chest containing the tools of a Tudor physician doing his best in a world before germ theory. There were longbows of English yew, some of the finest ever found, strung and ready, belonging to archers who never drew them that day. There were dice and gaming boards for the hours between watches. There were the bones of a dog, small, probably a ship's mascot, lost with everyone else. These objects do not tell a story of heroism or ambition. They tell the story of men who packed their things, ate their breakfast, performed their duties, and found themselves in the water before they understood what was happening. They are the evidence of lives lived at close quarters, in a wooden world that smelled of tar and salt and unwashed bodies, where the hierarchy between a master gunner and a common sailor was expressed in the quality of their eating utensils and the distance between their sleeping spaces. Tudor England, with all its court intrigue and theological upheaval and imperial ambition, compressed into a single ship's company on a summer morning. For more than 4 centuries the Mary Rose and everything she held lay undisturbed. The Solent's tides shifted sediment over the years, eventually burying her so completely that she became, for all practical purposes, invisible. The story of her loss was documented, mourned briefly, and then absorbed into the long record of ships that navies lose, one entry among many in the accounting of Tudor warfare. She had been seen to sink. No one doubted she was there. But the sea had hidden her with such thoroughness that finding her again would require tools and techniques that did not yet exist. She would wait. The silted Solent is patient in the way that water is always patient, which is to say completely, without sentiment or intention, simply preserving what the currents chose to preserve. Somewhere beneath the shipping lanes, beneath the ferry traffic and the pleasure boats of later centuries, the Mary Rose kept her cargo of lost mornings, the pewter jugs, the shaving mirror, the longbows no one drew, all of it waiting as wrecks wait for the moment when the world finally comes looking. The world did come looking. It just took 426 years. By the mid-20th century, the tools available to underwater archaeologists had begun to change what was possible. Side-scan sonar could sweep the seafloor and return acoustic images of buried or partially exposed structures. Sub-bottom profiling could detect anomalies hidden beneath silt, and in the years after World War II, a growing community of divers and maritime historians had begun to take seriously the idea that wrecks were not salvage opportunities or curiosities, but archaeological sites, places where the past had been physically preserved, layer by layer, in the precise order that events had deposited it. The search for the Mary Rose began in earnest in the 1960s, driven largely by the historian and diver Alexander McKee, who had developed a conviction that the wreck was not simply a collapsed scatter of timber and rust, but an intact, buried hull. McKee partnered with sonar specialist Harold Edgerton, and with the newly formed Mary Rose Committee, which would eventually become the Mary Rose Trust. For 7 years they worked the Solent's muddy bottom, correlating historical accounts of the sinking with the geography of the strait, eliminating areas, narrowing the search. Then, on the 1st of May 1971, a diver named Percy Ackland touched something in the silt and felt the curve of old ships' frames beneath his hands. The Mary Rose, after more than 4 centuries of waiting, had been found. What followed was not a quick excavation. It could not be. The site demanded a patience and methodological precision that matched the scale of what had been preserved. From 1979 onward, the wreck was divided into a purpose-built grid of yellow pipe, a framework that allowed every timber, every artifact, every structural element to be assigned a precise location before it was moved. Divers worked with hand tools, with airlifts to remove sediment, with water jets for more delicate work, cataloguing their findings on numbered dive logs that formed a continuous record of the excavation. The conditions were difficult. The Solent's visibility is poor, its currents unpredictable, and the divers working below were operating inside what amounted to a fragile, irreplaceable archive that could be destroyed by a single careless movement. Thousands of dives were made over 3 years. More than 19,000 objects were brought to the surface, each one representing a moment in a morning in 1545 that had been frozen and sealed the instant the ship went under. The hull itself lay tilted at 60 degrees on its starboard side, and it was the starboard side, the side buried deepest in the protective anaerobic silt, that had survived. The port side, exposed to the water column and its currents for centuries, was largely gone. This meant that the Mary Rose the world eventually recovered was, in a sense, half a ship, but what a half. The preserved section included multiple decks, structural elements that revealed how such vessels were actually built rather than how later artists imagined they were built, and the sealed spaces where the crew had lived and worked and, on that last day, died. The raising itself became something that had rarely happened before in the history of archaeology, a live public event watched by millions of people. On the 11th of October, 1982, the crane barge Tog Moor positioned itself over the site. A steel lifting frame and cradle had been carefully rigged around the hull over the preceding weeks, a process requiring the same obsessive care as the excavation itself. Television cameras were there. Prince Charles, who had been a patron of the project, was there, and at a point that morning the cradle lifted clear of the seabed for the first time since Henry VIII had watched it sink, and the Mary Rose came up through the water and into the air, streaming the silt of the Solent from timbers that had not seen daylight since the reign of his father's son. The crowds who watched understood in that moment that they were seeing something genuinely unprecedented. This was not the recovery of a shipwreck, it was the recovery of a world. But the drama of the raising was only the beginning of a challenge that would prove, in some ways, more difficult than finding the ship in the first place. Wood that has spent 4 centuries saturated with water cannot simply be allowed to dry. The cells of the timber, which had been held in shape by water replacing the organic material that had long since decayed, would collapse if the moisture was removed too quickly. The hull could shrink by as much as 50%. The wood could crack, warp, and crumble into something unrecognizable. The Mary Rose Trust understood this, and the moment the hull was clear of the water, it was wrapped in water-saturated foam and subjected to a continuous spray of chilled fresh water, a process that would continue for more than a decade. From 1994 to 2013, the hull underwent treatment with polyethylene glycol, a conservation agent that works by infiltrating the microscopic voids within waterlogged wood and replacing the water molecules that had been doing the structural work. A network of over 500 meters of pipe was installed around the hull, delivering approximately 40,000 liters of PEG solution per day. First, a low molecular weight PEG to fill the finest cellular structures, then, from 2004, a higher molecular weight formulation to increase the mechanical strength of the timber. It was conservation on a scale, and at a level of technical sophistication that had never been attempted before, and the team developing the methodology was, in many cases, writing the protocols that the rest of the world would subsequently follow. The air-drying phase that began in 2013 was itself a feat of environmental engineering. The hull was enclosed in a climate-controlled structure, a kind of enormous, carefully managed atmosphere, where temperature and humidity were regulated with precision, drawing more than 100 tons of water out of the timbers over 3 years, while preventing the catastrophic shrinkage that uncontrolled drying would have caused. By 2016, the hull was stable enough for permanent display. The Mary Rose Museum in Portsmouth, designed specifically around the wreck, placed visitors directly alongside the preserved hull on one side, while displaying the recovered artifacts on the other. The objects and the ship they came from reunited in the same space, visible simultaneously. The design won the Museums and Heritage Award for Conservation in 2014 and became a benchmark for how maritime heritage could be presented without diminishing either the object or the story. What the Mary Rose project changed was not just the practice of underwater archaeology, though it changed that profoundly. It changed the broader understanding of what a wreck is and what it can do. Before the Mary Rose, the prevailing model of shipwreck recovery was essentially extractive. You found things, you brought them up, you put them in display cases. After the Mary Rose, the model shifted towards something more like total recovery. The idea that a wreck site is a complete historical environment, that the spatial relationship between objects matters as much as the objects themselves, and that the process of conservation is not a footnote to the story of discovery, but a central part of it. The Mary Rose had crossed a threshold. She'd gone from being a legend, a name in Tudor records, a famous disaster, a ship that Henry VIII had watched sink, to being the most complete surviving example of a Tudor warship ever recovered, a physical document of 16th century naval life that no written source could have provided. She was, in the words of those who had worked to bring her back, not a shipwreck at all. She was a time capsule, and her recovery marked the point at which maritime history stopped being purely a discipline of documents and charts and became something that could be touched. The Solent still runs above the place where she was found, ferries and container ships crossing water that spent centuries hiding one of its greatest secrets. The ship's other half remains buried in the seabed, in situ, as the archaeologists say, preserved in the mud for a future that may have better tools than we do. What was brought up is enough. It is more than enough. The Mary Rose proved that the sea does not only destroy, sometimes it holds things in trust, waiting for the world to become capable of understanding what it is being given. The Mary Rose, in the end, gave up its secrets slowly but completely. What makes the next story so different, so persistent in its grip on the imagination, is that it has never given up anything at all. On the 4th of December, 1872, a brigantine named the Mary Celeste was spotted in the Atlantic Ocean, roughly 400 nautical miles east of the Azores. The crew of the British vessel Dei Gratia, which had been sailing the same general route from New York toward Gibraltar, noticed something wrong about the way she moved. A ship under sail has a quality of intention. She answers her helm, she trims to the wind, she holds a course. The Mary Celeste held nothing. She was wandering, her sails partly set, drifting in a way that had no human explanation. When a small boarding party crossed to her, they found the decks empty. They searched the holds, the cabins, every space a person could occupy. There was no one aboard. There had been 10 people on that ship when she left New York. There were none now. What the boarding crew found when they looked more closely made the situation stranger, not simpler. The Mary Celeste was seaworthy. She was not in distress in any conventional sense. Her hull was sound, her cargo was largely intact. 1,701 barrels of ethanol-based alcohol bound for Genoa, sitting in the hold as if nothing had happened. The ship's stores of food and water appeared sufficient for months. Personal belongings remained in the cabins. The captain's navigational equipment was still present. Whatever had caused 10 people to leave this vessel, they had apparently not taken much with them, and they had not been given long to think about it. 2 things were absent. The ship's single lifeboat, a yawl, was gone, and the crew was gone with it. There was also approximately 3 feet of water in the hold, which is not an insignificant amount, but it was not enough to threaten a ship of the Mary Celeste's construction. She was, by every measure available to the men who boarded her, a vessel that should still have been sailing under her captain's command, delivering her cargo on schedule. That captain was Benjamin Spooner Briggs, born in 1835, an experienced and respected mariner from a New England maritime family. He was 37 years old when the Mary Celeste sailed from New York on the 7th of November, 1872. He had brought with him his wife Sarah and their 2-year-old daughter Sophia, as well as a crew of 8 men described by those who knew them as peaceable and first-class sailors. This was not a ship crewed by desperate men or troubled characters. Briggs himself was known as a careful, God-fearing captain who ran a disciplined and orderly vessel. Whatever happened aboard the Mary Celeste in the weeks between her departure and her discovery happened to people who, by every available account, were not the sort to panic easily or act without reason. The salvage hearings held in Gibraltar in early 1873 produced more questions than answers, and the newspapers of the day, the Times, the Manchester Guardian, the Boston Post, reported the proceedings with a kind of sustained attention, that transforms an incident into a legend. Theories circulated immediately, some of them sensational, most of them unprovable. Murder was suggested. Piracy was suggested. The inspectors examined the ship's structure and fittings closely, looking for evidence of violence or of catastrophic mechanical failure, and found neither in any definitive form. The explanations that have accumulated over the decades since then tend to cluster around a handful of plausible scenarios, none of which fully accounts for every detail. The cargo of alcohol had produced fumes. This much seems physically certain. And one theory holds that the captain, detecting or fearing a build-up of explosive vapour in the hold, ordered everyone to abandon ship on a lifeline, keeping pace with the vessel while the hold was ventilated, only for that line to part in a swell, severing the connection between the drifting ship and the people trailing behind her. Another theory focuses on the water in the hold and the possibility that a faulty sounding rod, the instrument used to measure water depth in the bilge, gave a false reading that dramatically overstated the flooding. If Briggs believed the ship was filling faster than she actually was, he may have made the calculation that the lifeboat offered better odds than a sinking hull, and made it quickly, without time to gather more than the essentials. A clogged pump would have compounded that fear and compressed the time available for rational assessment. Mutiny has been proposed, though the description of the crew makes it a difficult case to sustain. A submarine earthquake or waterspout, sudden, violent, frightening enough to trigger evacuation, has also been raised, and the Azores region is not without seismic history. Each of these explanations has advocates. None of them, it must be said plainly, has been conclusively proven. The boarding party found no bodies. No wreckage from the lifeboat was ever definitively identified. No survivor ever came forward. Benjamin Briggs, Sarah Briggs, Sophia Briggs, and 8 sailors crossed the Atlantic and vanished from history in the space of a few weeks, and the ship they left behind went on sailing without them. It was the persistence of that image, the empty, seaworthy ship moving through open ocean with no one at the wheel, that caught the attention of a young writer named Arthur Conan Doyle in 1884. 12 years after the discovery, with the facts of the case still unresolved and the public appetite for the story still unsatisfied, Doyle published a short story in the Cornhill magazine titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. It was fiction, presented with the texture of testimony, and it took tremendous liberties with the historical record. Doyle renamed the ship, calling her the Marie Celeste, a spelling that was incorrect but that lodged so firmly in popular memory that many people still use it today, and constructed an elaborate narrative explanation that involved race politics, revenge, and deliberate mass murder. The story was so convincingly written that the American consul in Gibraltar initially believed it might be a genuine account and demanded clarification. The British press debated whether it contained hidden truths. It did not in any factual sense. But what it did was something more durable than fact. It gave the story a shape, a dramatic architecture, that the actual historical record had always refused to provide. Conan Doyle's fictional Marie Celeste was a mystery that got solved. The real Mary Celeste never did. And paradoxically, it is the real version, open-ended, unresolved, resistant to any clean explanation, that has continued to haunt the imagination far longer than any invented solution could. The Mary Celeste has been written about, filmed, theorized over, and returned to again and again across nearly a century and a half. What each generation finds when it looks at the case is more or less what the crew of the Dei Gratia found when they stepped aboard that December morning, a ship in good order, provisions for months, personal belongings left behind, 10 people gone without adequate explanation. The sails were set. The compass was in place. Dinner, some accounts suggest, may have been recently prepared. The sea was simply empty where people should have been. We can say with confidence what the Mary Celeste was carrying. We can describe her dimensions, name her captain, trace her route. What we cannot do, what over 150 years of scrutiny has not allowed us to do, is say with certainty why 10 people got into a small boat and left a sound ship to drift alone across the Atlantic. That question hangs over the record like fog over open water, obscuring the one thing that would make everything else make sense. The sea does not always keep its secrets buried in silt, waiting for the right technology to bring them up. Sometimes it keeps them in plain sight, in the middle of a well-travelled shipping lane, aboard a ship that anyone could board and examine, and still tells you nothing. There is a particular kind of dread that belongs not to the unknown but to the familiar, the moment when something entirely ordinary, something proceeding exactly as expected, simply stops. The Mary Celeste was strange because of what was found aboard her. The SS Waratah is strange because of what was never found at all. The Waratah was, by every reasonable measure, exactly the kind of ship that was not supposed to disappear. She had been built in 1908 by Barclay, Curle and Company on the Clyde, a steel-hulled passenger and cargo liner stretching 465 feet, displacing just over 9,000 gross registered tons, rated at her launch as plus 100A1 by Lloyd's of London. That designation was not merely administrative, it was a statement of confidence, the maritime establishment's way of declaring that a vessel met the highest standards of construction and seaworthiness. Her owners, the Blue Anchor Line, operated regular passenger routes between Britain and Australia, and the Waratah was their newest and largest ship. Modern, well-equipped, freshly certified, she carried with her the full weight of Edwardian faith in engineering. She was on her second voyage when she left Durban on the morning of the 26th of July, 1909. The route was a familiar one, south and west along the South African coast to Cape Town before continuing toward Australia. She had made this passage before without incident. Aboard her were 22 cabin passengers and 193 in steerage, along with her crew, bringing the total to roughly 211 souls. Her cargo included general merchandise and, sitting deep in her holds, approximately 1,000 tons of lead ore concentrate, dense, heavy and practical, the kind of freight a working liner on a commercial route would routinely carry. There was nothing remarkable about her manifest, nothing unusual about her itinerary. She was a modern ship doing exactly what modern ships did. The last confirmed sight of her came from the steamship Clan McIntyre, which encountered the Waratah in the early hours of the 27th of July, somewhere off the mouth of the Bashi River on the Eastern Cape coast. The two vessels exchanged signals in the pre-dawn darkness and into the morning, and the crews of the Clan McIntyre saw nothing alarming. The Waratah appeared to be proceeding normally. Then she moved on ahead, and the Clan McIntyre continued at her own pace, and the two ships drew apart in the ordinary way of ships at sea. The captain of the Clan McIntyre would later describe what came next as the worst weather of his 13 years at sea, a severe cyclone that swept the South African coast with extraordinary violence in the hours that followed. When the storm had passed and ships began arriving at Cape Town, the Waratah was not among them. A search began on the 1st of August. The tug T.E. Fuller went out first, followed by HMS Pandora, HMS Fortin, and later HMS Hermes. They were looking for wreckage, for lifeboats, for cargo, for any floating debris that might indicate where a ship of nearly 10,000 tons had come apart. They found nothing. In September, the Union Castle cargo ship Sabine traced the coast again. In 1910, the tug Harry Escombe extended the search further. Still nothing. On the 15th of December, 1909, the Waratah was officially declared missing. 211 people had gone with her, and the sea offered no account of any of them. What made the silence so difficult to accept was precisely what had made the Waratah seem so safe. She was not an old vessel fighting rust and fatigue. She was not a small craft caught beyond her operational limits. She was a large, modern, Lloyd's-certified liner on a well-travelled coastal route in the middle of what should have been a standard passage, and yet she produced no wreckage, no survivors, no distress signals that anyone heard, no lifeboat that anyone found. The ocean simply absorbed her, completely without residue. In the years and decades that followed, investigators and theorists turned to the question of why. Several plausible explanations have been proposed, and it is important to say clearly that none of them has been definitively proven. The storm alone was a candidate. The cyclone that struck the South African coast that night was ferocious by any account, and the Bashi River stretch of coastline has a reputation among mariners for generating violent, confused seas. A rogue wave of sufficient size could conceivably overwhelm even a large vessel, driving her down before anyone had time to respond. But there were other concerns that preceded the storm. Before the Waratah left on her final voyage, questions had been raised about her stability. A civil engineer named Claude Sawyer, who had sailed on the ship's first voyage and disembarked at Durban precisely because of his unease about her behaviour, gave testimony at the inquiry describing a ship that rolled heavily, recovered slowly, and gave him the persistent feeling that she was carrying too much weight too high. He had dreamed of disaster, he said, a detail that invites scepticism, but his underlying observations about the ship's motion were not dismissed out of hand. Several other passengers had noted a similar quality, a sluggishness in the way she returned from a roll. Then there was the cargo. Lead-ore concentrate, when it absorbs moisture and is subjected to sustained vibration, can liquefy, a process called cargo liquefaction, in which a dense solid load shifts suddenly and catastrophically to one side, robbing the vessel of her stability in seconds. A ship carrying 1,000 tons of lead ore in that condition, caught broadside by an extreme wave, would have very little time. She might roll once, far and fast, and not come back. There would be no opportunity for distress signals. There would be no organised evacuation. The passengers in their cabins, the crew at their stations, they would simply find the world tipping violently away from them, and then there would be water everywhere, and then there would be nothing. This is speculation, and it must be labelled as such. But it is the kind of speculation that fits the available facts. A ship with reported stability concerns, a heavy and potentially vulnerable cargo, a violent storm on one of the roughest stretches of coast in the southern hemisphere, and an absence so complete that not a single piece of identifiable wreckage was ever recovered with certainty. Emlyn Brown, a South African researcher, devoted years in the 1980s and 1990s to searching for the wreck using sonar equipment, scanning the seabed along the most probable track. He found anomalies. He investigated. Nothing confirmed. The Waratah remains to this day unfound, her location unknown, her last moments unwitnessed by anyone who survived to describe them. She has been called the Titanic of the South, and the comparison carries weight beyond mere drama. Like the Titanic, she was a new ship, a confidently built ship, a ship whose loss was received as a kind of impossible verdict against modern engineering. But unlike the Titanic, the Waratah left nothing behind that could be studied, raised, preserved, or used to reconstruct the sequence of events. The Titanic, for all its horror, eventually gave up its wreck, its artifacts, its structural evidence. The Waratah gave up nothing. What she gave instead was the particular unease that comes from certainty dissolving without explanation. The passengers who boarded her in Durban that July morning boarded a Lloyd's-certified blue anchor liner on a routine coastal passage. They had every reason to feel that they were in capable hands on a capable ship. Whatever happened to them, in a storm, in a swell, in the dark hours of the 27th of July 1909, happened quickly enough that no word of it reached shore. The sea that took them left no margin for understanding, no wreckage to grieve over, no answer to bring back to the people waiting on the dock at Cape Town. Only silence, stretching out from the Bashi River coast, still unbroken more than a century later. The Waratah vanished in an instant, or close enough to one that no trace survived. What happened to her was almost certainly catastrophic and swift. But there is another kind of disappearance, one that unfolds not in a single violent night but across decades, and it belongs to a ship that refused, in the most literal sense, to go away. The S. Bechimo began her working life far from the Arctic, launched in 1914 at Lindholmen's shipyard in Gothenburg as the Ångermanelfen, a steel-hulled cargo steamer of 1,322 tons, 70 metres long, powered by a triple-expansion steam engine, of the kind that made her a reliable workhorse rather than anything remarkable. She was built to carry freight, and carry freight she did, unremarkably, through the early years of her existence. It was not until 1921 that she acquired the name Bechimo and the role that would define her legend, when the Hudson's Bay Company purchased her for service along the Canadian Arctic coast. In that remote and punishing world, she became part of the machinery of the northern fur trade, delivering provisions to scattered outposts, taking on pelts, threading through the coastal passages of a frontier that most of the world would never see. She was a working ship in a working landscape, her purpose entirely practical, her reputation unremarkable. No one watching her enter an Arctic harbour in the late 1920s would have suspected she was accumulating the credentials of a ghost. The autumn of 1931 changed that. By October, the Bechimo was navigating the waters off Point Barrow, Alaska, laden with furs when the ice closed around her. This was not an unusual hazard in Arctic waters. Ice was the fundamental condition of that environment, the thing every captain and company calculated against in every season. But that year, the freeze came faster and harder than anticipated, and the Bechimo found herself locked in place, unable to move forward or back. The crew waited, camping in a temporary shelter they built on the ice nearby, hoping the conditions would shift. They held on through October. Then, on the 24th of November, a blizzard struck with enough violence to force the decision no captain wants to make. The crew abandoned the vessel, trekking over 1/2 mile of ice to reach the settlement at Barrow, where they could shelter in safety. Before they left, a small aircraft was used to retrieve the most valuable portion of the cargo. The furs at least would be saved. The ship herself was written off. Hudson's Bay Company recorded her as a loss, a vessel surrendered to the ice that had captured her. The expectation was straightforward. The Arctic would do what it always did, and the Bechimo would eventually be crushed or sunk. The Arctic had other plans. When the blizzard cleared, the Bechimo was gone. Not sunk, simply gone. The ice had shifted and the ship had moved with it, drifting free into the frozen labyrinth of the northern coastal waters. And then she began the decades-long journey that would make her the most persistently haunting vessel in the history of Arctic navigation. Just a few months after her abandonment, she was sighted drifting crewless. Then again in 1933, when a group of Inuit encountered her and boarded her, only to find themselves trapped aboard for 10 days when the ice closed in around them. They survived and eventually made their way to shore, with a story that was difficult to explain by any ordinary understanding of how ships behaved. A prospector named Leslie Melvin came across her in 1934, then again in 1935. In 1939 there was an attempt at salvage, but the ship slipped away again before the effort could be completed. In 1962, a group of people encountered her still adrift. The last documented sighting came in 1969, when a group of Inuit reported finding her frozen into a pack of ice, 38 years after her abandonment, and still, apparently, afloat. The environmental explanation for this persistence is real and worth understanding, because without it the Bechimo becomes pure myth, and the actual strangeness of her situation gets obscured. Her hull was steel, robust enough to resist the crushing forces that would destroy a weaker vessel. The near-freezing temperatures of Arctic water dramatically slow the process of corrosion that steadily degrades ships in warmer seas. And pack ice, despite its destructive reputation, does not always crush what it captures. It can also lift, pressing beneath a hull, raising a vessel up rather than squeezing it apart and then carrying it along as the ice mass drifts. In the right conditions, an abandoned ship in Arctic waters is not necessarily doomed. The same environment that traps can also preserve, can also transport, can turn a stranded vessel into something that moves endlessly through a landscape where human witnesses are few and far between. This is why sightings of the Bechimo were not continuous but intermittent, sometimes separated by years. The Arctic is vast and largely unwatched. Between encounters, she could have been locked in ice hundreds of miles from the nearest settlement, invisible to everyone simply because no one was there to see her. When she did appear, emerging from a fog bank, drifting past a hunting party, materializing in waters where no ship was expected, the effect on those who saw her was profound. An empty steel ship moving slowly through Arctic channels without crew or smoke, or any sign of human presence, is a sight that reaches past the rational mind before the rational mind can catch up. The Bechimo acquired her reputation as the ghost ship of the Arctic, not because she behaved supernaturally, but because the environment gave her appearances all the qualities of a supernatural event, sudden, unexplained, recurring across time spans that outlasted the logic of ordinary material objects. The folklore came quickly, as it always does when documented history starts to feel too strange for comfortable explanation. Inuit communities and the trappers and prospectors who worked those coasts began to speak of her as something beyond a merely lost ship. She was unsinkable, some said. Cursed, others suggested, in the mode of the Flying Dutchman, condemned to wander the northern waters without ever finding rest. The comparison to the old Dutch legend was natural enough. Both stories involve a vessel that should be gone but isn't, appearing to those who encounter it as a violation of the expected order of things. The difference, of course, is that the Bechimo was real, documented by named witnesses across nearly 4 decades, recorded in company accounts and news reports and personal testimonies that can be checked against each other. She was not a sailor's yarn spun in a dockside tavern. She was a registered vessel with a known history, a specific hull number, a paper trail extending back to a Swedish shipyard in 1914. What the folklore and the documented history share is the same underlying source, the Arctic itself. That environment operates by rules that sit just outside the range of ordinary maritime experience. Time moves differently there, in a practical sense. The cold preserves what warmth would destroy. The remoteness conceals what populated coastlines would reveal. The scale of the ice fields can swallow a ship and hold it for years before releasing it into sight again. The Waratah vanished completely in a matter of seconds or minutes. The Bechimo vanished slowly, repeatedly, across decades, which in its own way is the more unsettling story, because it suggests that disappearance in the Arctic is not necessarily an event. It can be a condition, a state of being that a vessel occupies indefinitely, seen occasionally, lost again, never quite resolved. No wreck has ever been found. The Bechimo's final position is unknown. She may still be there, somewhere beneath the ice of the Beaufort Sea or the Chukchi, her steel hull preserved by the cold that once set her free. She may have sunk eventually, quietly, with no one nearby to observe it. The Arctic, having kept her secret for nearly 4 decades of documented wandering, has shown little inclination to give her up now. Of all the ships in these waters, and in these stories, she may be the one whose ending is most genuinely and permanently out of reach. The Arctic kept its secrets in silence and cold, in ice fields so remote that a wandering ship could drift for decades without a witness. What happened in the North Atlantic on the night of the 14th of April 1912 was nothing like that. It happened in full view of more than 2,000 people, under a sky of extraordinary clarity, on a vessel that represented the absolute pinnacle of what human engineering and human confidence could produce. And yet what unfolded in those hours has generated more sustained fascination, more persistent argument, and more cultural weight than almost any event in the history of the sea. The RMS Titanic left Southampton on the 10th of April 1912 on her maiden voyage to New York. She was the largest moving object ever built at that time. 882 feet long, 46,000 tons, 9 decks rising above the waterline, 4 funnels cutting the horizon in a silhouette that announced power and permanence before anything else. She'd been constructed at the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, the product of years of planning by the White Star Line, who intended her and her sister ships to dominate the transatlantic route not through speed, that was Cunard's game, but through scale and luxury. The first-class accommodations included a swimming pool, a squash court, a Turkish bath, and dining rooms panelled in the style of Georgian country houses. She carried 324 first-class passengers, 284 in second class, and 709 in third class, along with roughly 900 crew members. Aboard her were industrialists, socialites, engineers, emigrants, families beginning new lives in America, and the simply wealthy making the crossing in the comfort they were accustomed to. The atmosphere was one of occasion and confidence. That confidence had a specific shape in April of 1912. The Titanic had been described in contemporary materials as practically unsinkable, a phrase born from her design, which featured a double-bottomed hull and 16 watertight compartments, any 4 of which could flood without threatening the ship's ability to stay afloat. Her builders were serious men making technical assessments, but the language drifted, as language tends to, towards something more absolute. By the time she sailed, the ship carried the weight of an idea as much as a fleet of passengers, and that idea was that the marriage of modern industry and ocean travel had finally produced something that the sea could not defeat. The sea had been listening. At 23 minutes past 11 on the night of the 14th, Lookout Frederick Fleet, stationed in the Crow's Nest without binoculars — the binoculars for the Crow's Nest had been left behind in Southampton — saw something in the darkness ahead and rang the warning bell. The iceberg. The officer on the bridge ordered the engines reversed and the wheel turned hard to starboard, and the ship began to respond, but an object of that mass moving at 22 knots cannot be redirected in seconds. The iceberg passed along the starboard side, and what looked from the bridge like a near miss was, below the waterline, a catastrophe already in progress. The collision had not punched a dramatic gash into the hull. Instead, the iceberg had buckled and separated the steel plates along a series of points on the forward starboard side, opening breaches across 5 of the 16 watertight compartments. The designers had accounted for 4. 5 was the number that tipped the calculation past the point of survival. Water began to flood into the bow, and the ship's own weight began to do the rest. The accepted explanation for the sinking is precisely this. The iceberg collision caused progressive flooding that the ship's design could not survive. The sequence has been reconstructed in detail from physical evidence, survivor testimony, and later examination of the wreck. In subsequent decades, other theories have surfaced in popular literature and documentary speculation. Among them, the suggestion that the ship involved was not the Titanic at all, but her sister vessel Olympic, swapped in an insurance fraud to cover the cost of an earlier collision that had left the Olympic damaged. These ideas have circulated persistently, and they are not without a certain narrative logic, but they remain speculation, without conclusive evidence to support them, and the weight of historical and forensic investigation continues to rest squarely with the collision itself. What the collision set in motion over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes was not a clean or orderly process. The ship's officers were working against a timeline none of them yet fully understood. The first distress signals were sent out, and the wireless operator on the nearby Californian had already switched off for the night, a fact that would become one of the defining symbols of what went wrong. The Carpathia, 58 miles away, picked up the call and turned immediately, but at her best speed she was more than 3 hours out. The lifeboat situation was what sealed the mathematics of the disaster. The Titanic carried 20 lifeboats, 16 wooden boats, and 4 collapsible canvas-sided craft, with a combined capacity of 1,178 people. There were approximately 2,224 people aboard. The regulations governing lifeboat capacity at the time were based on tonnage formulas developed in the 1890s, before ships of the Titanic scale existed, and they had never been updated. The Titanic was technically in compliance with the law. That compliance meant she carried enough lifeboats for roughly half the people aboard, and perhaps a third of her full permitted complement, and even those inadequate boats were launched largely half-filled, partly from confusion, partly from the early disbelief that the ship was truly lost, and partly because the loading process was chaotic and inconsistent in ways that inquiry reports would later document at length. Class-shaped survival in ways that became part of the permanent legacy of that night. First-class passengers had direct access to the boat deck. Third-class passengers, many of them emigrants who did not speak English and did not know the ship's layout, were separated from the upper decks by physical barriers and by a crew that, in many cases, was focused elsewhere. Women and children were prioritized, which saved many lives in first and second class, but the geography of the ship worked against the hundreds in steerage below. When the final count was established, approximately 1,500 people had died. Estimates range between 1,490 and 1,635 depending on the source and the method of calculation, making it one of the deadliest peacetime maritime disasters in history. Of those who survived, more than a third were crew. Of first-class passengers, roughly 60% survived. Of third class, fewer than 25%. The inquiries that followed in Britain and the United States did not struggle to identify the failures. There was the lifeboat provision, adequate by any standard that put human life first. There was the absence of lifeboat drills. Many crew members had never been trained in the loading and launching procedures they were expected to execute in an emergency. There was the wireless watch, maintained only during operational hours rather than continuously through the night. A gap that left distress signals unheard by ships close enough to have reached the scene in time, and beneath all of it was the culture of confidence that the ship herself had generated. A belief so thoroughly embedded in the decisions made that night that some crew members reportedly told passengers there was no cause for alarm, even as the bow continued its slow descent into the North Atlantic. What happened to the Titanic passed almost immediately beyond the category of maritime disaster, and into something else, a myth, a symbol, a story that cultures reached for when they wanted to talk about the limits of human pride, the indifference of the natural world, or the social structures that determined whose life was worth saving in a crisis. The ship became an argument, a lesson, a Rorschach test for every era that inherited the story. It was the subject of poems and newspaper editorials within days, of novels and films within years. It shaped maritime law internationally and forced the creation of the International Ice Patrol, which monitors the North Atlantic for icebergs to this day. The wreck itself, located on the ocean floor in 1985, became both an archaeological site and a cultural pilgrimage point, drawing submarines and cameras and an entire sub-industry of Titanic scholarship that has not diminished in the century since the ship went down. She was a real ship carrying real people on a real night in the North Atlantic. She was also immediately more than that, a vessel that the 20th century loaded with meanings before her hull had even cooled. Both things are true, and neither cancels the other out. The inquiries began before the Carpathia had even docked in New York. On the 19th of April 1912, 4 days after the sinking, the United States Senate convened its hearings, initially in New York and then in Washington, D.C. Over 18 days, more than 80 witnesses took their seats before Senator William Alden Smith and his committee, surviving officers, crew members, passengers from every class, wireless operators, and shipbuilding experts. The testimony that emerged was not just a reconstruction of events, it was a systematic dismantling of the assumptions that had made those events possible. The British inquiry followed under Lord Mersey, the Wreck Commissioner, and delivered its final report on the 30th of July 1912. Both investigations confirmed what physical evidence and survivor accounts had already suggested: collision with an iceberg, progressive flooding, inadequate lifeboats, a wireless watch that had gone silent at the worst possible moment, and a speed through known ice fields that neither court could defend. Lord Mersey's inquiry was, in some respects, more restrained in its criticism of the White Star Line than the American hearings, but both arrived at the same fundamental conclusion. People had died in numbers that did not need to happen, and the rules governing the sea had failed to keep pace with the ships that sailed it. What followed was the most sweeping reform of maritime safety law in history. The two inquiries fed directly into negotiations that produced the first international convention for the safety of life at sea, known as SOLAS, which was signed in London on the 30th of January 1914. The foundational demand was simple and overdue. Every ship must carry enough lifeboats for every person aboard. Not every person in first class, not the number dictated by a tonnage formula designed in the 1890s for ships half the size, but every person on every deck. Alongside that came requirements for mandatory lifeboat drills, for proper inspections of equipment before departure, and for higher bulkhead standards and extended double bottoms on new vessels. The rules that had allowed a ship the size of the Titanic to sail with boats sufficient for roughly half her passengers were gone. The wireless question produced its own reformation. The United States Radio Act of 1912, shaped in direct response to the hearings, mandated that ships maintain a continuous 24-hour radio watch, backed by secondary power supplies capable of operating independently if the main electrical system failed. The silence of the Californian's wireless room on that particular night, the operator had shut down for the evening just minutes before the Titanic's first distress signals were transmitted, had cost lives in a way that could be quantified, and legislators were in no mood to leave the same gap open again. These radio provisions were incorporated into SOLAS, establishing for the first time an international standard for distress communication that recognized the ocean as a shared space with shared obligations. The Ice Patrol had its own evolution. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, the United States Navy deployed scout cruisers to monitor the shipping lanes through the summer of 1912. From 1913 onward, the Revenue Cutter Service, the predecessor to the Coast Guard, assumed permanent responsibility for tracking and reporting iceberg positions in the North Atlantic. That duty became the International Ice Patrol, an institution that has operated without interruption ever since, gathering data from ships, aircraft, and eventually satellites, and issuing warnings to vessels crossing the same waters where the Titanic went down. It is one of the longest-running direct consequences of a single maritime disaster, a watch kept now for more than a century because of one night when no watch was kept at all. But the changes ran deeper than regulation. The Titanic had done something to the public relationship with technology that no amount of legislation could fully address. In 1912, the idea of the unsinkable ship had not been a boast, but a sincere expression of what industrial engineering was believed to be capable of. The collision with an iceberg did not merely sink a ship, it sank a category of confidence. The machinery of the modern world, the argument went, had outgrown human wisdom about how to use it. Ships had become too large, too fast, and too freighted with the assumption of their own invulnerability. The Titanic became the permanent counterexample. The thing you reach for whenever a new technology was described as foolproof, infallible, beyond catastrophic failure. That cultural reflex is still active. It has never entirely gone away. The class dimensions of the disaster hardened into something equally lasting. The arithmetic of survival, first class at 60%, third class at fewer than 25%, was not a secret by the time the inquiry reports were published. It was discussed openly, written about extensively, and argued over in the press on both sides of the Atlantic. The Titanic became, in the political language of the early 20th century, evidence of what inequality looked like when stripped of its social conventions and reduced to its physical structure. The barriers that separated the decks were not metaphors. They were wood and steel, and they had corresponded with gruesome precision to who lived and who drowned. That argument found its way into socialist newspapers, into suffragist pamphlets, into American political speeches, and it has continued to find its way into every generation's discussion of the sinking ever since. The ship had become a mirror held up to the societies that built her. The wreck itself disappeared into the deep until the 7th of September 1985, when a joint American and French expedition, using an experimental unmanned submersible called Argo, located the debris field approximately 400 miles east of Newfoundland, roughly 13,000 feet below the surface. The images that came back, a boiler emerging from the sediment, the bow section lying largely intact in the darkness, were unlike anything the public had seen from the bottom of the ocean, and they changed what people understood to be possible in deep-sea exploration. The expedition, led by oceanographer Robert Ballard, had been partly funded by the United States Navy, which had its own reasons for interest in the deep-water search technology being tested. What the cameras found exceeded the expectations of everyone involved. The discovery ignited a new era in wreck hunting and underwater archaeology. The techniques demonstrated in locating the Titanic, side scan sonar sweeping wide corridors of seafloor, followed by remotely operated vehicles moving in close with lights and cameras, became the template for how subsequent expeditions would approach historic wrecks in deep water. The Titanic herself drew submarines carrying paying visitors, scientific teams studying the wreck's deterioration, and documentary filmmakers whose footage reached audiences of hundreds of millions. She became the most visited, most photographed, most argued over wreck in history, and she remained all of that while also being a grave, a fact that generated its own extended legal and ethical debate about whether objects could be recovered from the site who had the right to make that decision, and what obligations the present generation owed to the dead resting 13,000 feet below the surface of the Atlantic. Those arguments about ownership and heritage, who controls a wreck, who speaks for its history, who profits from its contents, would extend well beyond the Titanic, shaping the legal frameworks that govern every significant wreck discovery that has come since. The questions raised on the North Atlantic seafloor in 1985 are still being answered, or still being contested in courtrooms and international conventions that deal with maritime heritage law today. One ship, one night, one collision with a field of ice, and from it, a new international safety convention, a permanent ice patrol, reformed radio law, a century of cultural argument about technology and class and hubris, a revolution in deep-sea exploration, and a legal architecture for how the world thinks about the wrecks in its waters. The sea has held many ships and many stories, but very few of them have reached so far beyond the waterline, or continue to reach, generation after generation, without any sign of stopping. The reforms born from Titanic's wreckage, the lifeboat mandates, the radio laws, the ice patrols, reshaped the transatlantic crossing in ways both practical and psychological. Passengers who boarded ocean liners in the decades that followed did so under a different understanding, that the sea had been taken seriously at last, that the lessons had been learned, that the machinery surrounding them now answered to a stricter set of rules. And yet the sea does not stop testing. On a fog-covered summer night 44 years after Titanic slipped below the North Atlantic, a new ship and a new collision would remind the world that the distance between safety and catastrophe could still close with terrifying speed. The Andrea Doria was, by any measure, a statement. Launched in 1951 and placed into transatlantic service in 1953, she was 697 feet of Italian post-war pride, a floating declaration that the nation which had survived the destruction of the Second World War could still build something magnificent. The Italian line called her a floating art gallery, and the description was not excessive. Her interiors carried original paintings, sculptures and murals by contemporary Italian artists. She held 3 outdoor swimming pools, one for each class of passenger, at a time when a single pool was considered a luxury. A life-size bronze statue of Admiral Andrea Doria, the 16th century Genoese naval commander for whom she was named, stood watch in the first-class lounge. Everything about her was deliberate, considered, and beautiful. To travel aboard the Andrea Doria in the mid-1950s was to participate in an idea. The idea that elegance and modernity were not contradictions, that the Atlantic could be crossed in comfort worthy of the effort. On the evening of July 25, 1956, she was approaching the end of her westward crossing, carrying 1,706 people toward New York. The sea off Nantucket was thick with fog. The Andrea Doria's officers knew this, and they had the ship's radar operating, its sweep tracing the surrounding ocean for anything that might be sharing the lane. What the radar showed, around 11 o'clock that night, was another vessel, the Swedish liner Stockholm, outbound from New York heading east. Both ships had detected each other. Both were watching the same encounter unfold on their respective radar screens, and both, in the minutes that followed, would interpret what they saw in ways that placed them on a collision course, neither fully recognized until it was too late. The navigational failure was layered. Officers on both ships misread the other vessel's bearing and speed from their radar returns. The proper convention, established in the maritime rules of the road that the Titanic's aftermath had helped to formalize, was that 2 ships approaching head-on should each turn to starboard, passing each other on their port sides. Instead, the Andrea Doria turned to port. Stockholm turned to starboard. The 2 decisions, made independently and with what each officer believed to be good judgment, eliminated the margin between them. At approximately 11:10 p.m., the Stockholm's reinforced ice-breaking bow, she was designed for northern routes, struck the Andrea Doria on her starboard side, carving a gash roughly 30 feet wide through her hull. The wound was immediately catastrophic. 5 fuel tanks flooded, and the Andrea Doria began to list to starboard at an angle that exceeded 20 degrees within the first 30 minutes. That list, so rapid and so severe, became the defining mechanical fact of the disaster. The ship's portside lifeboats, hanging outward on their davits, swung too far from the hull to be safely loaded. Effectively, half the Doria's lifeboat capacity became inaccessible at the moment it was most needed, which meant that what should have been a survivable emergency aboard a modern ship with ample lifeboat provision was suddenly something closer to a crisis of the kind the post-Titanic rules had been designed to prevent. And yet the story that unfolded over the next 11 hours was not primarily a story of failure. It was, measured against the scale of what had happened, a story of rescue conducted with speed and effectiveness that the Atlantic had rarely seen. The distress signals went out immediately. The freighter Cape Ann responded first, arriving within an hour. Behind her came the US Navy transport USNS Private, William H. Thomas, and the destroyer escort USS Edward H. Allen. But the vessel that would define the rescue was already nearby, having picked up the distress call while outbound from New York. The French liner Ile-de-France, one of the grandest ships then crossing the Atlantic, reversed course through the fog and arrived at the scene with her lights blazing, a sight that survivors would describe for decades afterward as the most welcome thing they had ever seen. She alone would take 753 people from the stricken ship. By the time the Andrea Doria finally rolled onto her side and disappeared beneath the surface, 11 hours after the collision, 1,660 of the 1,706 people aboard had been saved. 46 passengers on the Andrea Doria died, along with 5 crew members of the Stockholm. The Stockholm herself, badly damaged, managed to limp back to New York under her own power. The contrast with Titanic was not lost on anyone. Here was a ship that had sunk in sight of a foggy American coast, where the waters were cold but not Arctic, where distress signals were heard and answered, where the full apparatus of mid-20th century maritime communication had functioned as intended. The rescue machinery built in the years after 1912 had worked. The loss of life, while real and grievous, was a fraction of what might have been. What followed the collision was a careful, methodical investigation, patient and analytical in a way that matched the disaster itself, which unfolded not in the sudden violence of impact, but in the slow, tilting certainty of the list that made escape difficult and escape necessary at the same time. Investigators documented the radar misreadings in detail. They established that neither ship's officers had followed proper plotting procedures, the systematic tracking of a contact's bearing over time that would have revealed the true geometry of the approaching vessels. They confirmed that the Andrea Doria had been maintaining approximately 22 knots through dense fog, faster than safety guidelines recommended, and they mapped the crucial moment when the two ships had turned in precisely the wrong directions relative to each other. The two shipping companies settled out of court before any formal adjudication could assign blame, which meant that the question of primary responsibility was left legally unresolved. That settlement became its own kind of enduring problem. Without a verdict, competing interpretations filled the space. Some analyses focused on Stockholm's third officer, who may have misset the radar range scale in a way that compressed the apparent distance between the ships and distorted his reading of their convergence. Others placed the greater weight of error on the Andrea Doria's officers for maintaining speed in fog and for the fatal port turn. Computer simulations conducted in subsequent decades have revisited the same evidence and arrived at conclusions that continue to be debated by maritime historians and safety specialists. No single account has closed the argument, and perhaps none ever will. What the Andrea Doria has become in the 50 years since her sinking is something that occupies a particular position in the history of maritime disaster. The case that demonstrates how thoroughly a modern ship could fail even when the broader safety architecture was working. The lifeboats were there, the list made them useless. The radar was operating, misreading it led to the collision. The radio system functioned. Rescue came in time to save the great majority of those aboard. The Andrea Doria is a story about the gap between the systems built to prevent catastrophe and the human judgments that, in a few compressed minutes of fog, and misread bearing lines can unravel them. She sank in 11 hours. The questions her sinking raised have lasted far longer. The Andrea Doria reminds us that even the most carefully engineered systems must pass through human hands. And human hands, under pressure, in fog, with instruments they trust too much or read too quickly, can falter. But there is another kind of maritime story, one that sits at the intersection of empire, war, and catastrophic loss, where the stakes were not only human lives but the financial foundations of an entire monarchy. To find it, we have to sail back across 3 centuries, away from the fog banks off Nantucket, away from the North Atlantic in the age of radar and radio, to the warm waters of the Caribbean in the summer of 1708. The War of the Spanish Succession had been bleeding Europe for 7 years by then. The question at its centre, who would sit on the Spanish throne after the death of the childless Charles II, had drawn in England, Austria, the Dutch Republic, France, and Spain itself, each manoeuvring for an advantage that was ultimately measured not just in territory but in treasure. Spain's empire in the Americas was still the most productive extraction system the world had ever seen. From the silver mines of Potosi in what is now Bolivia, from the gold fields and emerald deposits of New Granada, wealth flowed in quantities that stagger the imagination even at this distance. It moved by mule train down to the coast, by dispatch boat to collection points, and then, concentrated and crated and loaded under armed guard into the holds of great galleons, it crossed the Atlantic to fund whichever king was spending it fastest. In 1708, King Philip V needed that money urgently. The war was consuming everything his treasury could supply and more. The San José was the flagship of his treasure fleet, a 64-gun galleon of the first rank, one of the most powerful warships Spain had placed in these waters. She had sailed from Portobello on the Isthmus of Panama as part of a convoy of 17 vessels bound for Cartagena on the coast of New Granada, where the fleet would consolidate and then attempt the crossing to Spain. Her hold contained what contemporary accounts described, in terms that later historians have struggled to verify precisely, somewhere between 7 and 11 million Spanish pesos in gold coins alone, along with enormous quantities of silver bullion, crates of Andean emeralds, and Chinese porcelain that had made its way across the Pacific through Manila. The combined cargo, drawn from an empire that stretched from the Andes to the Philippines, represented months of colonial production concentrated into a single vessel. It was the financial oxygen that Philip's war machine required to keep breathing. She never reached Cartagena. On the afternoon of June 8, 1708, a squadron of British warships under Commodore Charles Wager intercepted the fleet in the waters near Baru Island, off the Colombian coast. What followed became known as Wager's Action, a naval engagement that lasted through the late afternoon and into evening. Wager had orders to take or destroy the Spanish treasure fleet, and his ships pressed the engagement hard. The San José, as the flagship, bore the weight of the British attack. Then, sometime around dusk, something went catastrophically wrong below her decks. Her powder magazine detonated. The explosion was enormous. Witnesses on both sides described the sky briefly illuminating over the darkening sea. The San José sank within minutes. Of the approximately 600 men aboard, sailors, soldiers, passengers, the officers and administrators of a colonial empire on the move, only 11 survived. Nearly everything else, human and material alike, went to the bottom. The strategic consequences rippled immediately. Spain's war effort lost not just the gold and silver and emeralds in that hold, but the momentum of a campaign season. Wager himself was unable to retrieve the cargo. The ship had gone too deep too fast, and he returned to England with the smaller consolation of captured vessels from the fleet's periphery. The San José had denied everyone, including the people who sank her, and so the legend began. For the next 3 centuries, the San José occupied a particular space in the imagination of treasure hunters, historians, and maritime lawyers, a wreck of confirmed reality and staggering theoretical value whose location remained genuinely unknown. In the 1980s, a Seattle-based salvage company called Sea Search Armada claimed it had located the wreck and sparked a legal confrontation with the Colombian government that dragged through courts for decades without resolution. The Colombian state's position was firm. The San José, wherever she lay, was Colombian national patrimony and the property of no private firm. Spain also had views, rooted in the argument that the ship was a Spanish naval vessel and that sovereign immunity attached to her and everything in her hold. Bolivia made a claim grounded in the origin of the silver from Potosi. The legal architecture around a wreck not yet definitively found was already becoming extraordinarily complex. Then, on November 27, 2015, the Colombian Navy announced what scientists and officials had quietly confirmed in the weeks prior. Working with a Remus 6000 autonomous underwater vehicle, a deep-diving robotic system capable of searching at depths far beyond the range of human divers, they had located a wreck approximately 600 meters below the surface of the Caribbean, off the coast of Cartagena. The identification was not speculative. The bronze cannons scattered across the seabed were decorated with dolphins cast into their surfaces, a distinctive marking known from Spanish naval records to belong specifically to the San José. After 307 years, she had been found. The Colombian government announced the discovery with careful, deliberate language. President Juan Manuel Santos called it one of the greatest finds in history. The coordinates of the wreck were classified immediately as a matter of state security. Officials confirmed the presence of gold coins, silver and ceramics, visible in the underwater footage, while emphasizing that any recovery effort would be subject to Colombian law and conducted with full regard for the site's historical and archaeological significance. The estimated value of the cargo in modern terms ranges from $17 to $20 billion, though those figures are necessarily approximate. The full inventory of what lies in that hold has not been catalogued, and market valuations of historic treasure fluctuate. What is certain is that the San José is, by any reasonable accounting, the richest known shipwreck in the world. But if you reduce the San José to its monetary value, you miss what the wreck actually contains. Those 600 men who went down with the magazine explosion, they were not abstractions. They were sailors who had spent months in the Atlantic, soldiers assigned to guard the cargo through whatever the sea and enemy warships might bring, merchants and colonial administrators making the crossing home, perhaps men who had spent years in the Americas and were finally returning to Spain. Their names are mostly lost, recorded in manifests that either never reached their destination or have not survived. The 11 who came out of the water were the witnesses to an event that no subsequent documentation fully captures. The gold in the hold was the reason the ship existed, but the ship was also these lives, and it took them as completely and finally as it took the silver. The emeralds from New Granada, the coins from Potosi, the porcelain carried halfway around the world before being loaded onto a ship that would carry it into the sea. All of it is part of a story about how empires moved wealth, how wars consumed it, and how the ocean, indifferent to the urgency of kings, simply kept what sank into it. The San José is an archive as much as it is a treasure chest. Whatever the legal disputes resolve, whatever eventual recovery or preservation effort the Colombian government authorizes, the wreck holds inside it a particular frozen moment of 1708, a world at war, a ship at the center of that war's financing, and a detonation in the evening light that ended everything at once. The questions of who owns what lies in those 600 meters of Caribbean darkness remain unresolved, and perhaps the most honest thing to say about the San José is that the legal argument over her future is, in its own way, a continuation of the imperial argument that sent her to sea in the first place. That question, who owns what lies in 600 meters of water, is not unique to the San José. It reaches far beyond one wreck, one government, one company filing court documents in Washington. It has become one of the defining legal and ethical arguments of our age, as deep-sea technology has made accessible a vast inventory of ships that previous generations could only speculate about. And the answers that different parties have given to that question reveal something fundamental about how human beings assign meaning, authority, and value to the past. Start with the competing claims on the San José because they illustrate the full complexity of the problem more vividly than almost any other case. Colombia asserts sovereign control over the wreck on the basis of territorial waters and national patrimony. The The ship went down in Colombian waters. It belongs to Colombia. Spain counters that the San José was a vessel of the Spanish crown, a warship operating under state authority, and that sovereign immunity attaches to such vessels indefinitely under international law, regardless of where they rest and how much time has passed. Sea Search Armada, the American salvage firm that claimed to have located the wreck decades before the Colombian Navy's 2015 announcement, has pursued its case through U.S. federal courts, arguing that it is owed a share of the discovery for its prior work, a lawsuit filed in the District of Columbia that has wound through the legal system without producing a clear resolution. And then there are the Characara, an indigenous people of Bolivia and Peru, whose ancestors extracted the silver from the mines of Potosí under conditions of forced labour so brutal that historians have called it a second conquest. Their argument is different in character from the others, less rooted in maritime law than in a moral reckoning. This wealth was taken from our people. It was never legitimately Spain's to carry, and the question of its ownership cannot be settled without acknowledging who produced it in the first place. 4 different frameworks, 4 different answers to the same question. The matter is now before the Permanent Court of Arbitration at The Hague, which suggests just how thoroughly the existing body of international law has failed to provide clear guidance. The 1982 United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, one of the most comprehensive attempts to codify the rights and responsibilities of states on the world's oceans, left the question of historic shipwreck ownership remarkably vague. It established frameworks for territorial waters, exclusive economic zones, and the deep seabed, but it did not resolve the central tension between state sovereignty over submerged territory and the claims that other parties, other nations, private salvors, cultural institutions, descendant communities might bring to objects resting on that seabed. That gap has allowed the San José dispute to persist and expand, drawing in more claimants, more legal systems, more irreconcilable interpretations of who has the right to decide. Running through all of these arguments is a deeper disagreement that is not really about law at all. It is about the difference between recovery and stewardship, between treating a wreck as a source of extractable value and treating it as an irreplaceable artifact of human history. Commercial salvage as an industry has a straightforward logic: locate the asset, recover the asset, sell or display the asset, profit. The incentive structure pushes towards speed and extraction. The archaeological counterargument is that a shipwreck is not simply a container of objects. It is a sealed environment, frozen at a particular moment, in which the relationship between objects, where a coin lies in relation to a crate, which deck a sailor's personal effect were found on, how the cargo was stowed and in what proportions, encodes information that disappears the moment you start moving things. Archaeologists working on wrecks like the Mary Rose understood this, which is why the excavation of that Tudor warship took years of painstaking documentation before the hull was raised. Every object was mapped, photographed, logged, and contextualized as part of a continuous record of life aboard a 16th century warship. The hull itself became a museum piece precisely because the goal was not to sell what was inside it, but to understand it. The San José, if its cargo were simply lifted and liquidated, would lose that kind of meaning entirely. The emeralds would become gemstones on the market. The gold coins would become collectibles. The porcelain would pass into private collections. And the wreck itself, the ship, the powder magazine, the scattered evidence of the explosion, the remains of those 600 people, would be stripped of the context that makes it something more than a pile of valuables on the ocean floor. It would become a hole in the historical record instead of a window into it. UNESCO's 2001 Convention on the Protection of Underwater Cultural Heritage takes a clear position on this. The treaty urges in situ preservation as the default approach, Leave the wreck where it is, study it carefully, do not exploit it commercially. And it explicitly limits the kind of salvage operations that treat heritage sites as profit sources. The principle is that the collective human interest in understanding the past outweighs any individual or national interest in extracting and monetizing what the past has left behind. It is a genuinely radical idea in the context of maritime law, which has for centuries operated on the salvage principle that whoever risks their resources to recover what the sea has taken earns a share of what they bring up. Colombia has not ratified the UNESCO Convention, neither has the United States. Spain and many European nations have. The inconsistency itself is part of the problem. International heritage protection only functions when the relevant parties have agreed to be bound by the same rules, and in the San José case, the key actors have not. What the San José dispute has exposed is the degree to which the explosion of deep-sea discovery in the early 21st century has outpaced the legal frameworks meant to govern it. Autonomous underwater vehicles, side-scan sonar systems, remotely operated platforms capable of working at depths of thousands of meters. These technologies have transformed a set of theoretical questions about ownership and heritage into urgent practical ones. Wrecks that were previously safe from interference simply because no one could reach them are now accessible. The inventory of what lies on the ocean floor is vast. An estimated 3 million shipwrecks worldwide, representing every era of human seafaring, every maritime disaster, every war fought on the water, every merchant vessel that sailed too close to a reef on a dark night. Most of them contain nothing of commercial value. Many of them contain incalculable historical value, and a handful of them contain both, which is precisely where the arguments become irresolvable under existing law. There is something worth sitting with in that number, 3 million wrecks, each of them a moment of loss, of cargo, of ships, and in most cases of lives. The sea does not distinguish between the San José and an anonymous trading vessel that went down in a storm off a forgotten coast in the 14th century. It received them all with equal indifference and kept them according to the particular chemistry of depth, temperature, and sediment that governs what survives. The famous wrecks, the ones with names and documented histories and contested ownership, are exceptional only in that someone knows about them. Below the headlines about the San José, below the legal arguments before The Hague, there are millions of unnamed ships in the dark, carrying the material evidence of lives and trades and voyages that have no other record. The question of who owns the deep is, at its root, a question about who is responsible for the past. Not just the convenient parts of it, the treasures and the famous disasters, but all of it. The ships that carried enslaved people across the Atlantic, the vessels that brought trade goods between cultures that never met any other way, the warships and the merchant ships and the fishing boats that went down with ordinary men who had no particular historical significance, except that they were alive, and then they were not. The ocean holds all of them equally. What we do with that, legally, ethically, imaginatively, is still being worked out. The 3 million wrecks the previous section described would be little more than a number, a figure too large to hold in the imagination, if not for the machines that have learned, in the last few decades, to see in the dark. What changed the entire enterprise of wreck discovery was not a single invention, or a single expedition, but a gradual accumulation of technologies that each solved a different piece of the same impossible problem. How do you find something you cannot see, in water you cannot enter, at depths where no human body can survive? The first of those tools is side-scan sonar, and understanding how it works is worth a moment, because it reframes everything that came before it. A sonar unit, mounted on a torpedo-shaped device called a towfish, pulled slowly behind a research vessel, emits fan-shaped acoustic pulses that spread outward across the seafloor in both directions. When those sound waves strike a hard object, they return to the sensor. Flat, featureless sediment scatters the signal uniformly. A ship's hull, or a cannon, or a pile of ballast stones reflects it sharply, producing a distinctive acoustic shadow on the resulting image, dark where the object blocks the sound, bright where it reflects strongly. A skilled interpreter looking at those seafloor mosaics can recognize a shipwreck the way a doctor recognizes a shadow on an X-ray, reading the shape of something hidden inside something else. A single pass of a well-configured sonar system can survey tens of square kilometers in hours, doing in an afternoon what divers and draglines could not do in years. This is precisely how the San José was finally confirmed after centuries of searching. Low-frequency side-scan sonar flagged a strong return from the seafloor at roughly 600 meters, far below the reach of any diver. An autonomous underwater vehicle called the Remus 6000 was then sent down to investigate, and the images it returned were unambiguous. Rows of distinctive bronze cannons, cast in a pattern unique to early 18th century Spanish foundries, lying exactly where the record said the San José had gone down. The ship that had eluded every treasure hunter since 1708 was identified not by luck or instinct, but by physics and patient geometry. The cannons did not need to be brought to the surface to be recognized. The sonar did not need to touch the wreck to find it. The search worked because the technology made the question of depth irrelevant. But finding a wreck is only the beginning of what modern science can do with it. Once located, the challenge becomes documentation, understanding not just that a ship is there, but what it looked like, how it lies, what it contains, and what the relationship between its scattered elements can tell us about the moment it was lost. This is where remotely operated vehicles, or ROVs, enter the picture. Unlike autonomous vehicles that follow pre-programmed routes, ROVs are tethered to a surface ship and piloted in real time by operators watching live video feeds. They carry high-definition cameras, laser scanners, manipulator arms, and increasingly sophisticated lighting systems capable of illuminating a wreck site in full colour in absolute darkness. Noé's Deep Discoverer has worked at depths exceeding 12,000 feet. Magellan's ROVs, Romeo and Juliet, conducted the most comprehensive survey of the Titanic ever attempted, spending months on the wreck site in the North Atlantic. What Romeo and Juliet produced from that Titanic survey illustrates just how thoroughly these technologies have transformed interpretation. 715,000 photographs, not a selection, not highlights reel. 715,000 individual stills, captured from every angle, at every depth of the wreck, from the still legible davits on the boat deck to the debris fields scattered across 2 miles of seafloor. Those images were then fed into a process called photogrammetry, in which software identifies matching points across overlapping photographs and uses the geometry of those matches to reconstruct precise 3-dimensional coordinates. The result was a digital twin of the Titanic, a navigable, centimetre-accurate virtual replica of the entire wreck, from the collapsed bow section to the stern's catastrophic disintegration. Researchers can now fly through the Titanic on a screen, measuring the exact degree to which the hull is deformed, tracing the path of the flooding, examining details that no human eye has ever seen directly, questions about the structural sequence of the sinking, the sequence in which sections failed, the mechanics of how the ship broke, can now be interrogated with a precision that was simply unavailable to earlier investigators who had only grainy submersible footage and partial sonar scans. The same photogrammetric workflow was used to document the Vernon Basin wreck, a far less famous site, from just over 4,000 photographs. A fraction of the Titanic project's scale, but enough to produce a complete 3-dimensional model of a ship that had never been formally excavated. The principle transfers across every depth and every era. Wrecks that previously existed only as partial drawings, disputed eyewitness accounts, or vague sonar returns can now be rendered as complete, shareable, interactively explorable records. The Mary Rose, which required years of painstaking physical excavation before its hull could be raised in 1982, could today be fully documented in situ in a fraction of the time, with the option to leave the physical wreck exactly where it lay while sharing its complete structure with researchers and the public anywhere in the world. That shift, from extraction to documentation, from recovery to interpretation, marks the clearest distinction between the treasure hunting tradition and what contemporary maritime archaeology has become. Earlier expeditions approached wrecks as problems of retrieval. The logic was essentially mining. Locate the deposit, extract the valuable material, process what you've found. Side-scan sonar was used in those contexts too. The raising of HMS De Braak in the 1980s followed a sonar detection, but the goal was to bring objects to the surface, and the information encoded in the relationship between those objects, in their precise positions and associations, was largely sacrificed in the process. What you gained in artifacts you lost in context. A gold coin lifted from a wreck and cleaned and displayed tells you that someone carried gold coins. A gold coin documented in situ, with its exact position mapped relative to a nearby cargo manifest and a set of personal effects, tells you something about who that person was, where they were going, and what their life meant in the world they inhabited. Modern programs, the kind now practiced by institutions like NOAA's Office of National Marine Sanctuaries or state underwater archaeology units, have restructured the entire process around that understanding. A wreck is surveyed in overlapping passes of multi-beam and side-scan sonar before anyone gets close to it. Magnetometer readings identify concentrations of iron and steel beneath the sediment. ROVs document the site in high definition before any physical contact. Excavation, when it happens, proceeds in carefully defined grids, with every layer photographed and logged before the next layer is revealed. Conservation begins at the moment of exposure, not after objects have been hauled to a deck in salt water. The data, all of it, not just the objects, becomes the record. This is not only better archaeology, it is, in a meaningful sense, a different relationship with the past. One premised on the idea that the story a wreck tells is more valuable than anything it contains, and that the purpose of going down to these places is not to bring them up into our world, but to understand them in their own. The machines that search the dark have made it possible to hold both things at once: the physical wreck, left where it lies, and a complete digital record that can be studied, shared, disputed, and revised indefinitely. The sea keeps its inventory intact. We keep a copy. Which brings us to the larger question that all of these stories have been circling from the beginning. Not just what the sea has taken, but what it has preserved, and what that preservation means for the way human beings understand their own past. The ships are down there. The tools exist to find them and read them. What remains is the older and more difficult work of deciding what we owe to the people who sailed them. There is a pattern to every story told in this script, and once you see it, it becomes impossible to unsee. A ship is built. It sails. Something goes wrong. A storm, a fire, a collision, a mystery that no survivor ever explains clearly enough. The ship is lost, and for a time, the people who knew it grieve and move on. Then the rumours begin. Someone claims to have seen it drifting. A document surfaces in an archive. A fisherman's chart marks the approximate position. Decades pass, sometimes centuries, and then a technology or a stroke of luck brings the ship back. Not the ship itself necessarily, but the story of it. And the retelling begins all over again, richer and stranger for everything time has layered onto it. This is how the sea remembers, not cleanly and not completely, but persistently, in ways that cut across archives as operas and novels, and the quiet insistence of oral tradition. Consider what survives of the Mary Celeste. The physical log ends on the 25th of November 1872, placing the brig 6 nautical miles from the Azores. A British inquiry recorded the condition of the vessel in careful bureaucratic language, the lifeboat gone, the cargo of denatured alcohol intact, the last meal seemingly still waiting. Those documents exist in the official record. But what most people know about the Mary Celeste does not come from the inquiry report. It comes from Arthur Conan Doyle, who in 1884 published a short story called J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement that transformed a baffling but documented maritime incident into something gothic and unsolvable. He invented details. He changed the ship's name slightly. He gave the mystery a sinister shape it had never quite possessed. And the version that entered popular imagination was his, not the inquirer's. The documented wreck and the literary ghost ship have lived alongside each other ever since, each lending the other a kind of authority. The documents give the legend credibility. The legend keeps people reading the documents. The Flying Dutchman works differently because there are no documents, no log, no wreck site, no physical evidence of any kind. What exists is a story that condensed from the fog of 17th century maritime lore. The accumulated dread of sailors who had watched ships vanish around the Cape of Good Hope and needed an explanation that matched the scale of their fear. That story was carried in oral tradition across generations of sailors, then captured in verse by Walter Scott and transformed by Wagner into a full opera in 1843. A grand, storm-drenched work that gave the legend its definitive modern form. There is nothing to excavate, no sonar return that would identify a phantom. The Flying Dutchman endures entirely because human beings needed it to endure, because the anxiety it expresses, the fear of a voyage that never ends, of being condemned to the sea forever, never loses its resonance. A legend without evidence turns out to be, in some ways, more durable than a wreck with a GPS coordinate. And then there is the Mary Rose, which offers something different again. The long, slow return of a thing that was physically lost and physically found. Henry VIII's warship sank in the Solent in 1545, taking hundreds of men with it. It lay there for 4 centuries, drifting in and out of memory, occasionally marked on charts, occasionally dived on, never fully recovered, until side-scan sonar in the 1960s and determined work through the 1970s located it precisely, and on the 11th of October 1982, the hull was raised from the water in a purpose-built steel cradle while the world watched. The timbers that came up were not just wood, they were personal effects, tools, clothing, weapons, musical instruments, the material texture of Tudor naval life, preserved by the very sediment that had buried them. The Mary Rose is now the centrepiece of a museum in Portsmouth, where visitors can stand within sight of the actual hull and look through glass at the objects recovered from its interior. The archive, the artifact, and the public experience of the past are fused into a single place. Titanic sits somewhere between all of these modes of remembrance. The wreck is real, located on the 1st of September 1985, and documented with an exactness that has only increased in the decades since, culminating in that extraordinary 2023 digital replica, a centimetre accurate virtual reconstruction of every visible surface. The historical record is extensive. Manifests, survivor testimonies, inquiry transcripts from both sides of the Atlantic, engineering reports. And yet Titanic also functions as myth, as the source of films and theories and arguments that will never fully resolve, precisely because the scale of the loss created a grief too large for facts alone to contain. James Cameron's 1997 film was watched by more people than will ever read a maritime inquiry. That is not a criticism. It is simply a description of how cultural memory distributes itself, unevenly, through whatever medium carries the most emotional weight in a given era. What all of these stories share is the quality of incompleteness. The Mary Celeste's last hours remain genuinely unexplained. No theory has been proven, and perhaps none ever will be. The Flying Dutchman offers no evidence to examine. The Mary Rose gives us thousands of objects, but not a single account from the men who went down with her. Titanic, for all its documentation, still holds arguments about exactly what happened in those final hours after the iceberg struck. The ocean does not resolve its mysteries simply because we have found better tools for looking. It holds them instead, preserves them in sediment and salt and darkness, hands them back a piece at a time, and lets us keep wondering. That, in the end, may be the most honest thing that can be said about every voyage, every loss, and every story that followed. The sea gives back what it chooses and keeps the rest.